Here with me today is Senator Blumenthal from Connecticut, who right now is leading the way to get S-1241, known as the Sanctioning Russian Act of 2025, pushed and hopefully signed by Donald Trump. So thank you, Senator, for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Joey.
So my first question is, before we dive into the bill, is you've dedicated a lot of time over the past few years helping Ukraine. What made you so invested in Ukraine, and especially helping out right now?
I've been to Ukraine 7 times since the most recent invasion, which of course was in 2022. The Russians invaded in 2014, and my interest in Ukraine really began at that point when I saw how deeply and importantly our own national security is at stake in Ukraine. If Vladimir Putin is able to conquer Ukraine, he will keep going against Moldova, Poland, the Baltic states, Finland, Sweden, any of them. And then we will be obligated to put troops on the ground under Article 5 of the NATO treaty. It isn't just a matter of legal, technical provisions. It's really our national interest that is at stake in stopping Putin. We know from history that appeasement has never worked. And especially appeasement of a bully, a brazen autocrat who is murdering women and children. I visited Bucha, where people were shot in the back of their head and buried in mass graves. I've met some of the kidnapped children who have been recovered. I've seen the bombed, decimated neighborhoods in Kyiv. And so, to answer your question very directly, it's a matter of national security, but also humanitarian instinct that has drawn me to the people of Ukraine and to President Zelensky, who is a leader of unmatched courage and conviction. And the people of Ukraine are unmatched in their courage and determination. So I've been inspired by them, as well as our own national interest, to take this cause as one that's very personal to me.
And I think we all definitely agree with you. I think that a lot of Americans see this as we worry that if Russia doesn't, if we are unable to stop them, that eventually one day our children would have to go and fight. And I mean, even today, we actually heard Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, appearing on Capitol Hill saying that, looking at the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, they're thinking about cutting back on a budget like that. And that worries a lot of Americans. Is there really anything that we can do as Americans to let our senators know, like, hey, we see that you guys are trying to pull back a little bit, but no, we kind of want you to move forward, because we're worried that if they don't stop, they could potentially involve us further.
Every American who feels, as I do and you do, Joey, that our national interests, our humanitarian instincts, and the moral imperative are all at stake here should contact your senators and your members of Congress. They need to be reminded that we have a role. We're not going to be the world's policeman. And by the way, not a single American member of the armed services or other has been a casualty in this war. The Ukrainians are fighting, bleeding, and dying. None of the Americans, they are fighting our fight. They're willing to die for their country. And so, to answer your questions very directly, tell your senators we ought to be providing them with the Patriot missile system and the radar that are necessary to defend their civilians. Putin is killing, murdering children, women, families, civilians in their schools, their apartment houses, their hospitals. He's doing it brazenly. It's not a matter of aiming for a military target and the missile or the drone going off course. I've seen where these missiles land, and they are in the middle of civilian neighborhoods. They destroy blocks, not just apartments. The magnitude is just staggering of civilian deaths and injuries, children losing limbs, women and men losing their children. Let your senators know we need to provide them with the air defense. We also need to provide them with long-range artillery and with drone assistance and, very importantly, intelligence. You know, the Ukrainians are now making their own drones. They're making
Yeah.
4,500 of them this year. I've been to the drone factories. They are endlessly ingenious. They are a can-do, scrappy people. It reminds me a lot of what I think we were like in World War II when
All came
our
together. Every single one of us came together to do the good fight.
absolutely. And, you know, anybody who visits Ukraine, I think, is struck by their ingenuity and innovation, but we need to help them. And what we can do to help them is not send troops. We're not putting our men and women on the ground. We're simply giving them the tools they need to win.
And you brought up a really good point there about air defense systems. I know just 2 days ago, Zelensky brought up the main mindset that, hey, United States, I told you guys a couple weeks ago, we want to buy air defense systems from you and put them here in Ukraine. And at this very moment, we haven't heard from the Trump administration whether or not they would actually allow that purchase to happen. The question is, what can be done so that the Trump administration can say, you know what, yes, let's allow Ukraine to buy these things?
I am going to work to put into our military budget, it's called the National Defense Authorization Act, also known as the NDAA, specific provisions that not only enable the administration, but also direct them to provide the Patriot missiles from other allies who may not need them right now. And that's where a lot of the aid is coming from. Let me say, Joey, very directly, I am really proud and admiring of our allies in Europe. I visited Ukraine just about 10 days ago with Lindsey Graham. We went there to meet with President Zelensky and his team and to see the effects of the most recent buying, but also to then visit with President Macron. We have talked to Chancellor Merz, the new chancellor in Germany, and they are foursquare, 100% behind providing Ukraine with whatever they can. But of course, their defense industrial base is limited. They can't manufacture all this stuff on their own. So that is why we need to enable more American military aid, more of the munitions they need, the artillery shells, the other equipment, but most important from the standpoint of trying to save lives is that air defense ability, because right now Putin is sending literally 400, one evening, 472 drones and missiles and bombs hitting Ukraine civilians, not military installations, but schools, neighborhoods, hospitals, and other places where families congregate.
And that's the one thing that a lot of people aren't understanding is that Ukraine, especially like Operation Spiderweb, for example, they're going after only military targets, whether they are going after aircraft and bases, whether it's ammunition depots, whether it's plants to make electronics. On the other hand, Russia, instead of actually going after anything in military wise in Ukraine, I actually don't think they can find those targets. They're terrorizing Ukrainians every day, whether it be Kherson, Kharkiv, Sumy, whether it be Kyiv, whether it be Lviv. It seems like Russia is getting kind of desperate on their attacks just to cause more, I guess, more issues for civilians versus actually going after military targets. Which brings me to my point of this bill. This bill would be sanctioning Russia in a bipartisanship sponsorship, which is extremely rare right now. So, how did you team up with Senator Graham to get this moving?
Senator Graham and I started visiting Ukraine literally right after the Russian tanks were pushed back from the outskirts of Kyiv.
Mm.
In fact, we visited Bucha, where the tanks still were because they had been stopped only recently. We went from Zelensky's bunker, where we spoke to him. We have, I think, met with him now upwards of 20 times. And we went to Bucha, the sites of the mass graves. And so we have been there numerous times together. And we formed a partnership on this issue. We disagree about a lot of things, but we now have 84.
84, that's great.
Co-sponsors, evenly divided, 42 Democrats and 42 Republicans. And you're absolutely right. It is rare beyond belief to have that kind of bipartisan, overwhelming support for a major piece of legislation. And let me just say, you use the word terrorize, and that is exactly the right word. Russia is proving to be a terrorist state. It's kidnapping children. Only terrorists kidnap and abduct children. Only terrorists try to strike horror in civilian neighborhoods. And the most recent Ukrainian victorious tactic, when they launched these drones at 5 of the Russian air bases, known as Operation Spiderweb, caused not a single Russian casualty. They were all aimed at the airplanes, the aircraft that deliver those bombs and missiles. It was, in a sense, a defensive strike. Brilliant, bold, but defensive and causing no casualties, even among Russian troops. So I think you're absolutely right to call attention to that fact. And I think that's one of the motivators for my colleagues in joining our bill, which would impose scorching sanctions on anybody buying Russian energy products, gas, oil, uranium, and so forth.
And I know this bill calls for it's a 500% sanction, if I remember correctly. My question for you is, have we heard from any allies that maybe are going to get hurt from this and saying, hey, you know what, maybe don't do it as harsh? Or maybe are they understanding like, hey, you know what, you got to do what you got to do here. We need to put more pressure onto Russia since diplomacy doesn't seem to be working.
We have met now with all of our major allies, UK, France, Germany. And by the way, Germany may well have to make some sacrifices here financially. They are 100% behind us. In fact, they are more strongly behind this bill than our own president.
Yeah, well,
Seems to go back and forth.
that is the actual next question I have for you. We can get this thing signed and it gets on the desk of the president and he just goes, you know what? We don't want this, because most recently we've seen him be more, I wouldn't say pro-Russia, but it feels that way. So what do we do here to make sure that if this bill gets on his desk, he'll sign it, no questions asked?
A couple of things, and that's a key question. Number one, we have 84 senators, which is a veto-proof majority. Number two, we are in conversations with the White House. We're trying to meet whatever objections or questions that they have. We don't want this to be confrontational. This should be, again, bipartisan. It should be a consensus, the president, the Congress coming together, sending a message to China and India, who buy 70% of Russia's oil and gas. You can't do business with the Russians and avoid these sanctions. We are going to hurt you if you hurt Ukraine. And you know what you're doing. You're buying Russian energy products. You are fueling its war machine. 70% of all that Russia gas and oil is the crux of their economic revenue that is making it possible for them to buy munitions from Iran, North Korea, and China. So we want to hit the Russian economy, but the Chinese and the Indians will pay a price if they fail to follow what's right, what's a moral imperative.
Which, I mean, we're all finding that the pressure is what's absolutely needed. It seems like every single time that Vladimir Putin feels like he's being painted inside of a box, he either does a midnight announcement or threatens nuclear war or use the Orshanik or something like that. And I think that potentially we're at a point in time to where hopefully Donald Trump is starting to understand that diplomacy, as well as he really wanted to try that, is really not the way here, especially because we're still seeing the same list of demands that Russia wanted since day one. They haven't changed anything. If anything, they just want more territory, Ukraine not to have a military, to have no support, not be a part of NATO, the EU, and really, truly have no weapons coming in from any country. And I guess as we're kind of now rounding this, second talk's already finished. We're seeing prisoner exchanges, but we're still not seeing that movement of Russia trying to give something up in order to have peace. If diplomacy doesn't work, do you think Donald Trump actually has a plan in place, or do you think he's just kind of winging it every step of the way?
I think he is winging it, and Vladimir Putin is making a fool of him. I hate to say it, but he is playing the president. He's stonewalling and slow walking because he wants to win on the battlefield. In my first answer, Joey, I mentioned 2014. That's the year that Russia invaded and conquered Crimea. It's the year that they invaded and conquered a good part of eastern Ukraine, Donetsk, Luhansk, and other areas in the east. This kind of assault is part of Vladimir Putin's plan to reestablish the old Soviet Empire, the old Russian Empire. The only way you think Vladimir Putin will come to the peace table is if he has no other choice. He's a thug. He's a murderer. He's a mob boss. He understands only one thing: force, economic force or military force. And to believe that somehow your personal relationship with Vladimir Putin will enable you to make peace, it's not going to make peace. It's going to make forced surrender. And that's why, if we talk about the art of the deal, everybody knows you come to the negotiating table with the highest point of leverage that you can. You have to negotiate from a position of strength. And that's what I think the president is missing here.
You know, the president talks about different kind of cards. Who has the hand? Who has got the best cards? And the one thing that, I'm learning as I've been covering this war since day one is, like that whole blow up at the White House in which we saw, everything that went down. Zelensky at that moment still had Operation Spiderweb already planned out. And a lot of people are saying that, well, after that operation went through, now Ukraine actually has some cards to deal with. I guess the question moving forward is, does Donald Trump see Ukraine winning this? Or is he still thinking in the mindset that, well, let's just let Russia continue. And then that way, once it's done, we could just do some deals with Russia and make some money.
I have to be honest, Joey. I have no idea what Donald Trump is thinking, at the bottom of his consciousness, or what his strategy is. I have the strong sense that he is basically winging it day to day. But to go back to that meeting that blew up in the White House, I think back to what Zelensky knew at the time about Operation Spiderweb, when the president of the United States taunted him in the Oval Office saying, "You have no cards." And Zelensky could have told him about that card, which is a pretty big one. Operation Spiderweb was, at that point, almost 18 months old, about to be launched. He kept it secret. And that's one of the really impressive aspects of that Operation Spiderweb, that they kept it secret. I was there virtually probably 48 hours before they launched it. Not a word of it. Now, I will tell you that Zelensky has more cards, in my view.
Yep.
He hasn't told me about what they are in detail, and I don't want to know, because I don't want to potentially, even inadvertently, talk about anything in the work. But anybody who thinks that the Ukrainian armed forces or the Ukrainian people have no cards to play, you are seriously underestimating this people. They have a lot of cards to play.
You had mentioned before that you're going back and forth at the White House. I guess the first question is, what are some of the things that the White House wants you to change in this?
I'm not going to go into detail because we're still in conversations. I think in general, the thrust of their requests is more flexibility, perhaps somewhat more authority for the president. We want to make it as airtight as possible and to provide for certainty, so the Russians don't think they can play our president, whether it's this one or any other.
When you mention, when it comes to the president, I know reading in the bill, I think it was every 90 days, the president has to make the decision for a covered determination. How confident are you that the executive branch will enforce this with the level of urgency that the situation still needs?
Well, the bill provides for congressional oversight as well as presidential authority. So it will be a partnership. I feel with its 84 co-sponsors, we've got a pretty solid showing for applying these sanctions rigorously. But you can bet that we will be watching closely how they are enforced. And you're absolutely right that implementation and enforcement are going to be key. And we'll be watching like a hawk. We've got a pretty solid showing for applying these sanctions rigorously. But you can bet that we will be watching closely how they are enforced. And you're absolutely right that implementation and enforcement are going to be key. And we will be watching like a hawk.
And then for my final question, how close are we to finally getting there? Because I mean, I've seen so many reports, even Mike Johnson says, we're ready for this. We're just waiting on President Trump. The grand question is, if we're looking at this bill right now, is there like a certain benchmark we're looking like? I mean, every night we're seeing almost 500 drones into Ukraine. What is the point that just goes, you know what, guys, let's just get it on the floor now and let's just get it signed? What is that point?
I can't give you a date, but I am hopeful that we are fast approaching the point where John Thune, who is the majority leader of the Senate, will say, let's just have a vote. And if there's a vote, it will pass overwhelmingly. We'll have more than 84. We'll have, I think, more than 90 senators vote for it. And the same in the House, an overwhelming bipartisan majority. So I think before this work period is over, namely before July 4th, I'm very hopeful we'll have a vote.
And that's what I'm hoping for. So before summer sessions really come in, we have something down there, because every day we're losing civilians in Ukraine because Russia decided to wake up today and just to target a building. Like today we saw another residential building hit. Luckily we're seeing the exchange taking of prisoners, but that doesn't help us lead to peace. It's just delaying it and delaying it. But Senator, thank you so much for joining me. I greatly appreciate it. Thank you for supporting Ukraine. You have no idea how much I appreciate it, and my family. My family's from Ukraine. And you've beat me with your trips to Ukraine. I've only gone 6 times so far. Only once during the war, but
Together.
yeah. Hey, next time you go, let me know. I'll be happy to join you. But thank you so much for your time. I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you, Joey.